Thank you for coming. My name is Peeter Tinits. I work on digital humanities related things in Estonia at the moment. I have a background in linguistics, and I found digital humanities through that. We use a lot of text corpora for it. And I'm going to talk about my experiences now. And before that, I also would like to thank you for inviting me, because I think it's been a really nice event, and I think these events are particularly important because we get to share what we have done. And okay, the workshops are one thing, but by talking to each other, we actually learn a lot, and I have also learned a lot during this summer school already. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you about my PhD thesis, which is almost complete, not quite yet. I've been doing it in Tallinn University on the historical sociolinguistics of Estonian. So looking at looking in greater detail at language changes of the past. And yeah, I will get to some of the background soon. So one thing that is important for the digital humanities projects, I think, is that it always starts with some question. That it's not that you're just exploring data and trying to get something sort of visually appealing out of it, but what drives it is the question. So for me, the question was what mechanisms are responsible for spelling standardization at the end of the 19th century Estonian? And it's based on research in historical sociolinguistics. And the use of text corpora, it's been there for a while, but I think they're getting to the interesting ways of how to use text corpora right now. So when I started with the question, I just thought, okay, anything that can be relevant can be used for this, and we should kind of try to find it together with my supervisor and other people who were all helping. And what I'm talking about, the timeline of it, it's sort of in the scope of a PhD dissertation, even though you can probably get away with doing much less. So don't be bothered by it. Yeah, so to give some background in linguistics first, there is a long going discussion in language change research about how much a particular individual can alter a language. So there's discussions leading back to 150 years ago saying that most changes within the language are something that an individual can't really help, and that we cannot really design it in any way. So if we try to write a dictionary and influence how people speak, it will usually be a failure. And then, so for example, Max Müller in 1861, Ferdinand de Saussure in 1916, Roger Lass in 1999, they have said something equivalent to this. And they're all, gurus in the area. And then there are other gurus who keep to the opposite claim, that this intentional language change is quite central to language phenomenon. It is common, and our languages are often subject to these pressures that we intentionally design them on them. So if we write a dictionary, it can have a huge impact on how the language works. I guess nowadays both sides of the argument are respected, and the question is how much and to which degree and in which conditions this intentional change can happen. So it has been a little bit controversial, probably because there has been a lot of effort to change language by intention, and a lot of discussion of what's a good language, what's not a good language. The French Language Academy, consists of very prestigious people who will tell you how to use the language properly. In most of our languages, we have dictionaries that we follow. We look it up for correct grammar, and this has become a really normal part of how we think about language. So for a linguist, that is something that is not necessarily true. There are potentially languages where the dictionaries play much lesser role. And as a linguist, I would try to describe what people really do. So in Estonia and Latvia, we respect the dictionary a lot, so we follow it. In many other communities, maybe not so much. So there is research that has shown that this is not the case for many languages. For example, there's 7,000 languages in the world now. Around 3,000 of them still are not written in any form. While I would say maybe 2,000 more probably have the Bible translated into them, but the people there aren't really using the language in written form. And so there are communities that probably are quite different in terms of this. And this goes back to history as well, that probably peasants in the 17th century, they didn't care about the language in the same way that we, in the same sense that we do, that you look up a dictionary. So to give an example, on the slide you can see on the right column, what are those? Probably it's clear. So these are different spellings of William Shakespeare that were in common use at the time. So most of them come from other people, but there are 6 instances of Shakespeare's own signature, and each of them has a different spelling as well. So at the time, even for their own names, people didn't care about spelling so much. English became standardized from around the 18th century onwards. This influential people wanted to improve their language a little bit and started following the dictionaries and kind of to get higher in social ranks, for example. And the word Shakespeare, as we know it, it was standardized only 1860 onwards. So it's been, actually for a long time, there was no clear way to spell the name, or an agreed upon way. So this spelling practices, they vary a lot by community, and the standardization research tries to look at which mechanisms are responsible for the spelling in particular communities. So what made people converge on the similar grammar? So people from different dialects come together, but they start to use the same form somehow. And my research question has been how this took place in Estonian. So that's the context of the research that I'm going to talk about. A little bit of background on the object. So I'm looking at late 19th century, and throughout the 19th century, very rapid changes took place in Estonia. It was quite similar in Latvia as well, so many of you will recognize the story probably that Estonian population was mostly spoken by the peasants, sometimes in the cities, but very rarely by the, let's say, political elite or people who were, I'd say, rich and ruled the land, but it was this low prestige language. And it was almost entirely spoken. So the Bible had been translated into Estonian as well, but Estonians mostly could read it, they didn't write really. So within that 1 century, there is a very quick development in literacy. It goes from about 20% to 95% in this basic literacy. People start writing to each other, people start writing books and buying books, so professional writers emerge. At the same time, there is intense travel and movement, so there is urbanization, people move from the countryside to the cities. There are railroads are introduced so you can easily travel between the cities, which means that people who were previously stuck to their own neighborhood and had different dialects, they will encounter a lot of people from other dialects. And at the same time, there was also movements of social and cultural modernization, so people really took kind of the European high culture seriously. They wanted to imitate it. You could see that the French have these dictionaries. Why don't the Estonians follow these dictionaries? For example, people were talking about these issues. And there was a movement towards becoming this nation that would be taken seriously in the world level. Yeah. So when language standardization took place, there were different forms for the same meaning. So for example, in English nowadays you have color and color, the American version and British version. And an event of standardization would be if it becomes one. So people would agree that let's just use this one. So there was variation initially in 1880s for some words for Estonian, and then it disappeared in some 30, 40 years. And the question is, how can this happen? So there are a lot of mechanisms that can support this. So for example, you can start talking like your neighbor, which means that if your neighbors change, they start to talk a different dialect, so you might follow them. Or if you move to the city, you might start to talk like people in the city, or maybe if you have pen pals, you start to write like your pen pals. So it's an influence of language contact. Another possibility is that you follow some sort of instructions. For example, in a school, teachers tell you how to write properly, or you follow a dictionary, you follow some kind of advice you read in the newspaper. So this would constitute a prescriptive influence within linguistics. Or a third option that you just survive longer, that let's say the old generation dies out and that grammar is no longer in use. So it's more to do with the young people coming up with different forms than people changing their way of speaking within a generation. And in order to study this, we need a lot of detail actually about the people who were doing the writing at the time. So this is just for background, but mainly I will try to talk about what this digital humanities related research entails and what kind of products and byproducts you get out of it, what kind of experiences you might expect. So I have this question, so now I should find the data. So what kind of data can I use to study the mechanisms of standardization, of spelling in late 19th century Estonian? First of all, I definitely need texts. So I need copies of people's writing in a hopefully digital format, so I can go through a lot of them at a time, so I don't need to use just a pen and paper. And ideally from different sets of people with different backgrounds, with different professions, with different levels of education, to see how these spelling forms travel between people. And there are options for this. So linguists have actually been compiling Linguistic Corpora for a while. So these are balanced collections of texts to be able to study changes within language. This can have some problems because these ones, they're usually balanced in a way that you have the language is similar across it. But if you want a broad representation of how the language practices were throughout the society, then you need to balance also so that you get lower educated people, higher educated people, you get people from different areas. So the ready-made corpora aren't necessarily that good for this kind of question. Nevertheless, for Estonian and for that period, there's two useful corpora. There's the written Estonian corpus, that has around 300 book snippets from different books from around 1890 to 1930. It was compiled in the late 1990s, and it mostly works, but it's not that big. And then you have the old written Estonian corpus, where they have digitized all text from 1500 to 1700, but from later times they have some texts, but not too many. And for this corpora, the text exists, but usually the metadata isn't very good, so I don't know who wrote it or what kind of a person that was right away. Even though for linguistic corpora that are already made, usually the text quality is really good, so they work for some sort of studies really well. So here we can kind of see over time where this text would be if we're interested in 19th century spelling variation. So there's, well, 2 texts in 1845, and there's 15 texts in 1905. So there are some texts, but it's not that big. On the other hand, for the last 20 or 30 years, people have digitized a lot of texts. And these texts are, well, available in different archives, in different formats, made for different purposes. So some are republished. So you take an old book and you republish it as an electronic publication. It costs no money at all, but you can maybe get some money from the customers again, if you have the rights for it. Or, well, much of this effort has been just to kind of preserve what is there. So maybe the material copies might disappear, and then we have an extra variant from this. For this, unfortunately, these are in many different archives, and each of those archives has different conditions in how you can access the text. Usually, they don't even think about, well, other than just showing you visually what's in there. And these archives, well, in Estonia, they don't talk to each other that well. There's some nice improvements here, but generally they are all independent enterprises and they don't worry about how it fits the bigger picture. So usually if I would have to get text from there, I would have to look for the text that they have for, let's say, 1880s to 1920s, and get a lot of links, and then from those links, follow those links, download the PDFs, or whatever format they offer, and then process them themselves. So they don't so far consider that much a possibility of doing text mining, of getting all of them at the same time, this variety of digital collections. But if you ask them, and if you just kind of use their interface a little bit, let's say, differently than designed, you use it, you web scrape some of the sources there, then they don't mind either. Usually, it's just an option they haven't considered. So if I want a collection of texts that exists but hasn't been made into corpora, getting it from all these different archives, that actually takes a lot of work. Then you probably will get a lot of PDF files. So these texts, they have been automatically character recognized, so they have the picture and the text on top of it as well. And when you get this automatically recognized text from the picture, then it usually isn't that good. Like, there's a lot of character errors, but it can be used for some purposes as well. But let's say that this text is enough, so we can take this PDF, we can convert them into text files that through, well, for example, there is a command line tool in Linux that just takes a PDF file and converts it into a TXT file based on the layer that is there. So it doesn't use any visual information, it just uses the text information that's in the file. And then you will get something like this. The text isn't very visible, but it mostly works, but many of the words are broken, and many of the lines are broken, many of the sentences are broken. So you have to be quite critical about how you're going to use it. So getting sentences out of it is much more complicated than getting words out of this one. Yeah, but okay, if we have done our job, then we get a large collection of text files from here that we can process in other tools. And by the way, if anyone wants to interrupt, then I'm fine with that. You don't need to wait until the end if there's something confusing. So okay, in my case, I tried to get the texts that were available. So I looked through all these archives and tried to get the text files, process them into something machine readable, and now I have this collection. But then in addition to that, I also need some sort of metadata. So I need to know under which kind of conditions this text was produced. Who was the publisher, who was the author, what year it was produced, how long is the work, what genre is the work, so on. So if we, for example, take the linguistic corpus, it has some sort of meta information, so you can get the name of the author, you can get the title, the year when it was produced, but you don't get anything else really. Like, you would have to add that. But in other cases, you do have these information collected about, for example, Edward Bonhoeffer and his biography that has been collected, but it isn't made into a database. It isn't structured as such. So the task there is to kind of combine it together to figure out a way to structure this metadata. So for Estonian, and which I didn't know in the beginning, so initially I just started collecting these various pieces of information and making a database. There exists Estonian national bibliography. I think Latvian bibliography exists in the same way, which is an index of all the books published, or tries to be the index of all the books published in Estonian or other languages connected, other publications that are connected to Estonia. But for me, it was just relevant, the ones that are written in Estonian, so it's really a great database that it has all the text that I would need. In addition to this information on the publication, so you get the author, you get the publisher, you get the town where it was published, there's usually genre markings, there is a lot of extra information. You get also links to digitized texts, which often are just images, but then sometimes they're not. So when you follow those links, you can build a pretty nice database of the text. And at the same time, there is also a collection of people. So some kind of person IDs connected to these books, and they can in turn be associated with other databases. So in fact, okay, one way is to collect all this information yourself, but by now there are these international databases that try to collect this kind of information. So one of the big ones is YAF, a virtual international authority file, which connects information about people and organizations across many libraries and other sources also, I think. So for example, Wikidata. And then you can start to combine them for a better data set. So for example, I can get this one person, Julius Amisepp. Within the Estonian database, there is information that he was born in 1883 and lived until 1950, but not much else at the time. But it does have a link to this YF window, which is just, I'd say, it's a collection of links. So it links different databases together and tries to aggregate them. And from this YF, there are also links to Wikidata and Wikipedia that contain a lot of information in addition to that. So there's, well, you probably know Wikipedia, it collects a lot of information in free form. Wikidata tries to include the same information, but in a structured form as a database, so you can process it later easier. It connects to other libraries and so on and so on. So if we have this piece of data, then from one database we can get the birth date, yeah. But then, for example, the German National Library also includes information about the birthplace and the profession of him, which we can also use as metadata for the corpus. Then it also links to Wikidata, it links to Wikipedia, which also includes information about the birthplace and where this is located. You can get the coordinates of it finally, and you can create a pretty complex data set. Now, in addition to that, there's other databases that aren't linked to this. So if I want to use them, so for example, there is an Estonian biographical database that includes information about people in a more or less structured form, but you need to process the text. Then in order to join those databases, I would have to link them manually. So I need to create indexes of both of them and try to match them. So if the name is the same, then they go together. And yeah, this is, I think, something really integral to digital humanities research, that there is a lot of automated things that you do, but then there are so many manual tasks that you need to do in order to get your data into the format that you need. Often this needs some kind of humanities background, so maybe you need to know about the people who lived in the 19th century, so particular authors, whether there's common pseudonyms or things like that. Well, with names it's easier, with other information it can be more difficult. So, when combining these data sets together, there is a phase of linking it. Well, I use also Excel for this, which works pretty well. And another thing that is necessary to do if you want to analyze the data within these bibliographies, then these have been built to preserve. So they have exactly the information that the book contains. So, for example, if it was written in Tartu, it can include as its name Dorpat, Jurjev, Terpt, Tartu, or it can use Cyrillic, it can use Estonian. It's been exactly reproduced. Same with Riga, same with other places. So you would need to harmonize the data somehow. There are more automatic means for this, there are less automatic ones. I just used this, or crudely looked at the basic variants of it and then replaced them with a central one. And as a result, you can start making some kind of general statistics about who wrote these books. So to give a kind of overview of this YF, for example, there's around 60,000 person entries within this Estonian National Bibliography database. Almost all of them link to YF, at least easily automatically. Then from this YF, for the same set, there's about 30,000 entries that match it within the German National Bibliography set, which has a different set of information that can be useful as well. And if you follow further, then they also link to Wikidata entries. And there's also a large amount of them, almost, well, half of them link to Wikidata as well. And then there are a number of people who had some association with Estonia that are present in Wikidata but aren't present in the other archives. So in principle, if you combine them, you can get you can start gradually increasing the amount of information you have about these people. So these are all the people it goes. It's not just the 19th century, but everyone associated with book publishing at the time. If I look at the people relevant to this period, then there were about 10,000 names that were associated with any kind of book production there, but many of them was just A.A, so you can't actually find the person behind them. These could be easily linked to the YF entry, well, 1/3 of them approximately. Some of them had Wikidata links, some of them had links, had possible links within this biographical database in the National Library, and then altogether you could link about 1/3 of them. And when you link them, then maybe half of them also have this information on the birthplace. So this is just to give an overview of kind of data that was available. At the same time, through this text collection, I got around 5,000 texts instead of this 300 that was available before. But some of those files are really bad, so they don't really work for text mining, so you need to look at them critically. But yeah, from each collection you get some text, some of them are overlapping, some are not, so on. And yeah, so I mean, the idea is that I will kind of take you to the process of what it takes to make a corpus and then how to process it and then finally what you get out of it. So when you have these text files, then usually you don't want to analyze raw text, but you want to kind of generalize it somehow. So in this case, there are, again, automatic tools that make your life much easier. So for example, there's in Estonian this STNLTK, it's a Python package that I think, again, Latvian probably has a similar architecture. So if you used Python for other tasks during this workshop, then it's the same kind of thing. You just run your text through a Python algorithm, and as a result you get not just words, but you get, for example, lemmatized words. So instead of rabbit and rabbits, you get just one version, rabbit, and you can start looking at how many rabbits there are in this text. Which already starts to kind of give some sort of interesting information about the corpus that is there. The light is not very good for this plot, but this portrays the lemmatization success of the algorithm on all these texts. And it goes over time from 1800 to 1940. And each point here is a book or a text. And it actually neatly divides into kind of 3 eras that really reflect how language worked as well. So around the 1870s, there was a transition from old way of spelling to a new way of spelling, where they changed almost all of the language, almost all of the words, just slightly to make it more like people were speaking at the time. And this automatic tool exactly cannot figure out around 60% of the words at the time, but then in the new spelling option, it can figure out already 20% of the words. So you can see this transition just from this very, very basic tool. And at second time, around 1920s, kind of the modern orthography really got started. So there was a dictionary, but then one of the main things you can see in the corpus here, they started using a simple V instead of a, well, double V. And again, you can see from the automatic results that there is a difference between these texts. There are also kind of texts that were really difficult to annotate in the last decade, but then this means that the text quality is quite bad. And this also needs to be taken into account when analyzing it. Yeah, but so what can we see from this? Already by looking at the metadata, we can get some interesting results. So this just plots the number of publications per year within the Estonian dataset. And there's not many until 1870s or so, then there is a little bit of an increase. Then a quick drop for First World War, then a lot of increase for independent Estonia, then the Second World War comes again, no one's publishing at the time, and then in fact there is a drop at publishing rates during the Soviet Estonian times, and at the same time really a huge leap in publishing from when Estonia became independent again. As you can see, culture influences already in this metadata. If you look at how this corpus compares to all of the text published, then actually it's a really high number, that there are around 15 or 20% of the texts that were published are available within this collection of texts, if we just assemble the digitized text. The quality varies, but most of them can be used. And at the same time, you can also see a growth in the number of authors, and the distribution of genres became different. So when people were writing more religious texts initially, then their fiction starts to become a more popular genre, which is in fact a characteristic of the language community that isn't discussed much, but actually matters also for sociolinguistics, that there are more writers and more readers, so it's a really more active and involved community there. You can see that Tartu and Tallinn dominate the industry of publishing, while in fact Tartu, while being a smaller city, that's the orange line here, there's actually a lot more publishing happening there than in Tallinn. Yeah. And you can also look at publishers, so when these publishers were making these publications. And if you look at within the corpus, then you can get nice time series of one publisher's writings. So for example, you can see that one of the publishers got started with writing the simple V early and then kept doing it, and other publishers started following it. Yeah, so this is just based on those two data sets of texts and the metadata. So the thing about digital humanities is that there is a lot of relevant scholarship actually done on these topics before, but they haven't been thinking about it in terms of data. So information is there in the books, but it isn't structured in a way that we can process them. So in order to use them, it takes some creativity to find them and kind of utilize them. But in my case, so I used biographic data from these databases. So I made this unstructured text into a structured text and combined these sources. But then also I used place name locations, so you can connect place names to a database that has coordinates for these names. And as a result, you can, for example, figure out where the writers were born, in this case. Which matters quite a lot for the study, because they have different dialectal backgrounds. Yeah, but there's other interesting things you can look at and find from her. So this is kind of new, so I haven't analyzed it fully yet. But for example, if we just plot the birthplaces of the people over time who are somehow associated with publishing these books. So this is these around 2,000 people who could be linked, and from those, some of those had birthplace information, others didn't. Then, okay, from 1820s, 1830s, you see kind of, well, good coverage, but these names here are mostly Germans who were just publishing in Estonian. Then you have 1840s. There is a strong dominance of the southern part of Estonia here. 1850s, south seems to dominate still. 1860s, there is a little bit more in the north, but south kind of, there's still a lot more names within the south. 1870s, it starts to average out a little bit. There's now more people in the cities. In Tartu, there's more people in Tallinn. Yeah, sorry, the towns aren't marked here, but if you know Estonian geography, you can see. So here is Tallinn, for example. Here is Tartu, and here is, well, And so it becomes gradually quite dispersed across the country, while for 1850s and 1860s and 1840s there seems to be a tendency that there's much more in South. So in fact there's historians of education have looked at the public schools within Estonia, and what you see above this line was part of Estland, and what you see below it was part of Livland, so with Riga. And Livland had earlier education policies, so much earlier they got many more schools. So each of those points here on the map is a public school, not by location, but just well, within that territory there were those schools. And in the south you have many more of them in 1851, while in the north it's still rare, while in 1881 it has become balanced out. So you have public schools everywhere across Estonia then. Which makes sense for this data, because at the time when you don't have many public schools, you also wouldn't get many people involved in publishing in the north. While then, as more public schools are built, you get the balancing out between these areas. And this is, how to say, a serendipitous find by just looking at places where the schools were and places where the publishers are from, that you kind of get free with this data. You can do other interesting things. So you can, for example, visualize the life histories of people within this data set. So here's the corpus of, well, here's the biographical database that didn't exist in standardized form before, but now like we can play around with it a little bit. And it just plots the places where people were active at the time. So when they went to study somewhere, they went to study in Tartu, the dot moves to Tartu. When they went to work in Tallinn, in a newspaper that was in Tallinn, it moves to Tallinn. So here's Tallinn, here's Tartu, here's Pärnu. And you can see these points moving around. So the color is the age, so it goes from 0 to 90. Green ones are young, red ones are pretty old. And you can see these dots moving around. And what's interesting here is that in the 1860s and 70s, there were a lot of dots across the country, while by 1930s, pretty much everyone that was like relevant for this biographical database, they have moved to cities, scattered around Tallinn and Tartu. And the people who are in the countryside still, they are old. So 74, 76, 72, 65. So it really shows the urbanization just from a data-driven perspective.
So these people are mostly, these are writers, right?
These are culturally relevant people. So the database doesn't include just writers, but also teachers, artists, musicians, teachers,
So that would explain why they are moving around in their midlife part, because in Latvia we have the same thing. So most of them, they studied in Tartu or St. Petersburg or Moscow.
Yeah.
Then they move back to their somewhat, for example, Lincoln and so on. And in the end of their life, they whether stayed in the place where they were actually born. For example, we had Bibliography, that's the place where everybody kind of returned. Or they stay in the city where they used to study, or the capital. So it seems the same.
It makes sense, yeah. You move for the place where they are.
And around 1890s, this first awakening that you had too was kind of the peak, or started to actually become like a normal thing, like that led to the independence and so on. So it's interesting to watch.
You mean that the travel, kind of living in the city became a normal thing?
Well, I think yes, but I think that's the middle part is the experience how, and they later on gain their influence as I don't know, as teachers or scientists or publishers. So it's interesting. I would like to see something like that in for Latvia.
Me too. Yeah. It's well, once you have the data, then animating is really simple. I can show you how there's packages for that, and it just works. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so what else? So information is everywhere. I also found that there were censuses from the time, so I was interested in kind of the dialect context between people. And again, they're not digitized as databases, but they're digitized as these tables. And these tables, it's possible to write them into a computer. There's also software to get, like if there's just a line graph like this, you can use the software to find out where exactly the points are and get the information from there. You can put this together. And yeah, you can, for example, it was possible to find out that how many of the people within Tallinn and Tartu in 1880s were immigrants, so who were born outside, so who weren't part of the natural growth trend, and that was around half the people at the time, so the urbanization was pretty intense. Other things that we can use, for example, if we take this birthplace, then in Estonia there are pretty distinct geographical dialect areas that do shape how people speak. So here's the main areas in different colors. And there is also a south-north divide that's pretty strong. So if we take one of the variants I was looking at, so whether they say ha or hea, then the green part was saying hea and the southern part here was saying ha. And this is something that so this is just from spoken language, but this is something that you should also see in the written text then, if this played a role. Other things, so based on the census data, you can also find out who, okay, so we have 50% of immigrants in Tallinn, but we can also find out where they were coming from. And here it's like the thicker lines mean that there were more immigrants from there. These are the counties of Estonia, but this Läänemaa and Järvamaa that were the closest ones to Harjumaa, and also they were in the same dialect area. So people were moving to the cities, but the cities had a lot of immigrants, but these immigrants usually had the same dialect background. So in fact, kind of unexpectedly, I wouldn't expect a lot of influence from there. Yeah, so if you look at cities, then here the red ones are the people who were born in exactly the same city, the green ones are the people who were born in the same county, and the blue ones are the people who were born in a different county. Then while most of the people were not from the city, then the people who had traveled there, they mostly traveled quite locally, which means that contexts the language wouldn't be that much different there. Yeah, so these are examples of kind of things that we might get as a byproduct of getting the data for the research that are interesting in themselves. Yeah, the specific question I had was about the variation within the language use, and there, you need to specify some kind of variables that you measure. You need to find suitable text combined with metadata, and then you can check the mechanisms. So I picked a set of variables that were easy to track, also in OCR text. So for example, whether it's a V, double V or V, A or Ea, V or U in these couple of words. Then how they pronounce this Herr, for example, in German, Naine versus Naine, versus on. They usually had a dialectal background, and they were fairly common at the time, and still are as a frequent terms. And so when we look at this within the corpus, we can put all the texts within these graphs. That one point is a text, and if it's really high up, then it uses the form that is really common nowadays, and if it's really low, then it uses only the forms that were common then, but are not common now. And you can see how the well, where each of the text were and also how the timeline went. So for this particular variant, you have kind of the modern form dominating until 1860s. Then you get the older form coming up for a short time, for around 10-15 years, and then it standardizes back again into modern form. So you can do this for many texts at the time, many of these variants at the time. You get something like this. One dot for each point, and then you can average these trends, and actually they make sense. So they went from this older form into a newer form gradually and through some kind of process. When I was talking about grammars, then one of my main sources then was people who had written about grammars, and they had kind of written up these proposals, these prescriptive dictionaries and newspaper advice that have been made, and they also include these variants. So I collected those and I put those on this timeline, that each blue line is a prescribed, an advice given to use the currently modern form, and the red one is an advice given to use the archaic form they had at the time. And if we put those on the same graph, then it actually, you can actually see how, maybe you can't at the moment, but if you look at it more closely, you can see that these events of advice, they are actually turning points in how they use the language. So it really had a lot of influence in how people wrote, and this would mean that people were following this advice quite intensively at the time. Yeah, okay, this looks a little bit more accessible. So you have the blue option here, and then it starts to go straight up. So initially it was a really uncommon form, but then because of this prescriptive advice, they got up there. Now, if I'm interested in the mechanisms of standardization, then I want to know, what mattered here? Was it the home dialect? Was it everyday language use? Was it education? Was it language prescription? What made the suggestion successful? Was it generational change versus individual change? And for this, I just took these time periods where there was interesting variation, and that happened after this language event. And then just applied the logistic regression model there, which, well, if you take this red area, this would be phase 1, then it shows whether some subgroups were more likely to be kind of at 0 or at 1. So, for example, from this model with 200 people, the trend was kind of flat, and the intended change was downwards, and you can see it's sort of going downwards. Then the older forms were more still towards the 1. Big cities were more towards the 1, or this kind of this modern form, while the educated people and the young people were more using the variant that was prescribed. And the same for this blue one, where just the intended trend was upwards, and both big cities and educated people were supporting it. And you can do this same kind of thing for all these different events and try to look at sort of who is leading the change, who is slowing down. And yeah, you can do many. I won't go through them because I think these details are not important, but generally you can see what mattered in people's choices for the variants that they used. You can try to generalize them. So there's a, well, what I could see here is that usually whenever the offered change was successful, then it meant that either young people or big cities had to kind of go along with it. And native dialect did not matter that much here. Yeah, there were some cases where it did, but it's specific. So yeah, well, how to say, this whole part, the actual study, I could do that only after all the data collection was done, and that was the fun part. But from this, I can see that these spontaneous changes do align with kind of an influx of new authors. So there's, oh yeah, I didn't discuss this, but for example, here I have this O without any kind of prescribed change that was due to people with a different dialect background joining the community. Then these events of prescription, they do line up with the trends quite clearly. And there is some kind of generation influence, so young people and large cities did matter a lot more for these linguistic norms than other places. But what to say about the study generally, that initially it looked like, okay, there's only these two small corpora and I can't do much with them, so I can't actually answer the question. But then when you look at it step by step, then this kind of useful data is pretty much everywhere and no one has collected it. So it's kind of an easy picking to pick it up and make it into a database. And already this first look can give pretty interesting insights. So who was, like how many immigrants from where did Tallinn have at the time? Yeah, which might give interesting insights to fear as well. And to give it a little bit of a general context, then, so this was one project. It kind of grew maybe bigger than was anticipated, but I think it's something to expect usually, that in this digital humanities research, at the moment, around 80% of the work is finding the data and getting it ready in a nice form. So it includes a lot of manual and technological work. And in my case, and I think it's also the norm, that you can simply use kind of good enough solutions that work at the time, but that aren't maybe the cleanest, but they work, and it's fine. Maybe, let's say 5-10 years in the future, we have already nice databases that don't need this work, but currently the situation is that you need to kind of expect some of this. Then, well, something for kind of maybe people who manage archives or will manage archives, that these open collections, they can really give you a lot of this byproduct information that might be difficult to anticipate. So you can't really expect that the birthplace of a person was something that kind of shows a culture trend, or by looking at which city the books were published in, that you can find out something interesting. But if you have these archives to maintain, then if you kind of open them up for data processing, then someone else can try and have a look at it, and it might give some interesting results. And also these byproducts of research can be pretty useful. So, for example, it took a bit of work to link up these databases, but now, after I'm done, they're linked, and someone else can use them for a lot of other research. So it even gives some kind of nice input back to the libraries who maintain these collections, for example, that this step can be skipped by other people. Or you get nice visualizations that give you an understanding of the collection. So how did the biographies of people at the time actually look like, if you really generalize? Yeah, and since this is, let's say, an educational context, then for anyone kind of starting out with similar kinds of projects, I was thinking what advice I have. And I think the first one would be kind of to start and stay open. So if you use this sort of code and processing and databases, then write your code in a way that you are happily able to share it, document everything you have, try to make as many steps of it as public as possible. I initially was unsure about something, so that at what point should I share these results, and now it's more complicated. That when the work has been done in a way that you didn't anticipate kind of the sharing, it takes an extra effort to do it, which I will do, but it's something you can start with right away. Secondly, when you kind of do one task, then try to keep in mind always how this fits to the entire project. That how to say, it's easy to get the visualization, but then when you come back to it 6 months later, then you might not be able to get it working again. So try to kind of place it right away into this final product that you want, and make sure it fits, and again, make it public as easy as possible. And thirdly, that don't worry about the lack of skills beforehand, in the sense that I used just a variety of tools that I learned along the way because I needed them for these particular projects, but this isn't something that I knew how to do beforehand. So, yeah, how to say it, if you haven't learned a particular software in a course, then it usually works the same way as other software that you've used does, so you can just kind of get started with it and try it out, but at the same time, do talk to the specialists, because then you can really save a lot of time, as there are many hidden tricks, and usually just one email, they will tell you that maybe this feature doesn't work at all, or you should use a different version of it, and there's hidden things that the specialist will know. Like, usually the problems in your research that you will have, they're not new, so there's solutions somewhere, like online, or people, if you talk to people, they might have these solutions. And at the same time, if you are in a humanities department, this might be a new area for them, so your supervisor might not be able to help with this, that you should kind of step outside the department or institute, come to, well, a summer school like this and talk about the specific issues that you have, and maybe they have easy solutions. Maybe you just find a person who has the same problems, and then you make a team and solve them together. Yeah. And yeah, if you know all these things, maybe you will be done with your PhD on time as well. I'm almost done with mine. Then I can give you a link to it when it's done soon. Yeah, but this is generally what you can expect when you do this sort of research. So I will share the slides as well, and there's the links to the interactive plots that are up there, at least temporarily. Yeah, that's all I have to say right now. We can discuss these things if you want. We have some time for discussion as well. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah.
Where do you store your raw data or your primary data, drafts, maybe, or codes?
I have a hard drive, and then I have a hard drive that's a copy of that hard drive, and then I have a cloud, and then it fails sometimes.
I wanted to ask for the public, for other scientists.
Oh, where to put it? Kind of in. If you're making it public, then there's, for example, Tartu University Library has an open data collection, which gives you a citation identifier. A very common kind of global option is Open Science Framework repository, where I put some stuff temporarily, but generally it's also a place to publish the data. But I know people who use it as a whole project manager center, that you just start with your first draft there, and you make the final publication there, and it just stores all the timeline along with the final publication. That might work, but where to store it while you're doing the job and it's not yet public, then one option is to do it public all the time. But then if that's not the case, then just make lots of copies and backups, and something will fail. It usually does.
Have you done anything with, I know that there are some population of Estonians in Russia because of the Russian Empire.
Mm-hmm.
So do you know any research about, have you gone further than the nowadays Estonian within the sense of language, because I've heard that those Estonians that went into Russia during the First World War and they stayed there, not a lot of them, but Estonians stayed the same, as you showed, like the language change, and it stayed the same, and the same thing that with Estonians that were deported in 1940s. Like, have you seen something like that?
I haven't looked at it personally, but I have heard the same thing about immigrants to the United States, to Canada, to the West. Yeah. And also, again, that's something that someone wanted to do years ago, but they never did. That to look at the books that were published by them, that they seem to use a more of these archaic variants, and maybe it's even visible within the corpus. But I haven't looked at it, but I think that should be true.
But that would be interesting then.
How it would fit with the standard part?
Yeah, I think it's more interesting to actually look at the language outside the borders of the state, because that's kind of an anachronism in a sense. Because you're looking at nowadays Estonian with the borders, like but I saw a few of the publishers are actually born in nowadays Latvia, but at that time it's the Russian Empire, so it would be more kind of.
It's more fluid.
Just an idea.
Yeah, I mean, if you're kind of isolated and abroad, then you would have your own community norms, and this might lead to interesting developments. And it's interesting also how conservative or innovative you are there. Maybe you're stay there, but at the same time, you might like.
I think there wouldn't be enough data for that, actually, for this exiled Estonians.
For historical ones, I mean, they would have to have published things in Estonian. But for modern ones, if we just do the interviews, then you might get these forms also. What I've heard about the Estonians in the West is that they are actually much more prescriptivist than Estonians, that they will really hate you if you mispronounce some word, even if you're an Estonian, because they like that it's more of a symbol there for some groups. Yeah.
There was a question? Yeah, thanks a lot. I wanted to ask you, we have used for the track the language change, you can use the binary region, right? So the option is either to choose one or the second out of the four. What to do, or what are the cases where you have more options than two? Like ternary choices, like three forms to choose of, and how to then analyze this kind of situations?
Good question. I mean, I just used like modern versus others. So in some cases there were several archaic forms lumped together, and then it was just between 0 and 1, so like so proportion. Yeah. I did, but because usually the third option was rare, so it wasn't. It was just that it was non-standard.
Yeah, and a follow-up. It seems that you have found like a lot of like bias changed, right? Some population effect affected the change, publications affected the change, age and stuff like that. But have you found like a random drift or something where just change happened, but you don't, the variables are not influencing things?
Yeah, I mean, some of those spontaneous changes beforehand, they were a bit mysterious, but they do kind of match the dialect patterns of people coming in, but on the other hand, I mean, I am testing who is the leader and who is the follower, but I'm not really, I don't have a really good method to test why they were leaders and followers, so they may have been accidentally kind of in the path to the future, but just as chance. So I haven't considered this drift option so much in this research. I should.
Thank you, Brandon.
Thanks for having me.